Good day. We are live. This is the third
Hello,
straight up
hello.
craft dev day. And today I'm Ben Parisic from Barrel Strength Design. We've got Selvin, who works with me at Barrel Strength and also independently at selvin.co, and Brandon Kelly from Pixel and Tonic, and Carlo Laitano, who's representing here. Today we're talking about craft entries, and we're just going to dive into this magical tag that helps us manage the content on our sites and see what we can learn about it, and go from there. So this is the craft entries tag. It helps us output all the data into the code. We've got craft.entries. And then any parameter we want from the parameter list. So we can chain parameters here to output our results, and I'm looping through those here at the bottom. We're basically setting what the results are to a variable and then looping through those entries and outputting each item. So in Twig, what we're doing is we're setting entry to each item in the array that is returned in the entries tag, and then we're accessing each parameter within that with dot notation, so entry.title, entry.body. And just to show that this actually works, we have a very simple website set up, and it doesn't work. We return all of our items here.
Awesome.
That's one syntax. We can start chaining this syntax. And what did I get wrong with the ID syntax? Was I? Oh,
You're retrieving one?
there was no database with ID 1. So if we pass a specific, the item with ID 3 also gets selected there. So that's our first syntax. It's chaining these items together. We'll move on to syntax 2, where we again call craft.entries, and then instead of just adding find to the end of our string here, which triggers the search, we're going to pass an object to find, and we're passing a value, our parameter section, and the item news, and works a charm. We see our results, and if we want to add multiple parameters, have multiple parameters. And finally, if we want to not include our object here in the find tag, we can move that object out of the find tag. And here's method 3, where we've essentially taken what was in this find tag up here and created a variable with that information. And if we simplify that, pass that params variable to our find tag, and once again we're outputting entries.
Nice.
And we can limit them to parameters. So that's the craft.entries tag in use. Anybody want to raise any questions here or use cases?
I do actually, because I've been looking, for so long under the hood that I haven't actually gotten to do a lot with all of the Twig fun stuff that Craft has created. So it's really I think that I'm excited about that. I mean, I know I've known the power of entries, and I've used them mostly from the back end, but I guess this question is kind of for Brandon. How do you guys manage supporting 3 different syntaxes, and also resolving objects and arrays to support the same syntax for both? Because you could have a native object and you could have an array, but they both could behave similarly, right, with the dot notation. Are you guys doing anything special behind the scenes besides get object vars or something like that?
Yeah, well,
I am going to, for your reference, Brandon, I am going to be opening craft_variable.php, elementservice.php, and ElementCriteriaModel.php as we go on here. So,
okay, so
Oh, sweet.
maybe
Maybe
this,
there.
yeah, we'll get to that later then, I guess.
Okay, sweet.
okay. Well, I mean, so there's not much more to say here. I mean, there's plenty more to say, but the concept really is what we're going for here in that we're passing parameters, and here in the docs we can see that the craft entries tag has several different parameters after archived author group, and all of these parameters have certain values that you need to pass them, and so we can really build as complex a query as we want there. Um, there are a few parameters that do fancier things, maybe we could say. Maybe they're all fancy in their own way. Um, one of the cool ones to know about are the child of and parent of parameters, and those allow us to basically show related entries. Um, these can also be limited by fields. So if you don't want to retrieve the entire related entry, we can retrieve just the actual field we want related, or a string of fields that we want related, or I mean an array of fields that we want related. And that brings us to some, I think, two neat little features that maybe we take for granted with these are that parameters can actually take single or multiple values. So if we wanted to, we could pass multiple values to one of these parameters here. And I believe, is it just comma delimited syntax? Is that right?
You could have common delimited string, or you could define an array.
We can pass an array, or we can have a comma delimited string. So there's a couple different syntaxes, and they're referenced down at the bottom here. Um, but But the cool thing is we can pass, I guess, multiple parameters to every single one of these, multiple values to every single one of these parameters. And we can even use to these parameters. So if we didn't want to receive one uh, of our values, we can tell it not to do that as well. So so there's a lot of different things we can do here and a lot of cool stuff. The one other one, and as we'll be looking at it a little more later, is and search is you out when you need to do something a little more than what is allowed here. You want to return a specific, I guess you could search generally, and I'll pull up. There's a search documentation page, which is going to give us a lot of different options here. But we can search generally and just add a word in there, or we can search more specifically and add our field or string that we want in there as well. So
Does the like if you were searching for something in a field name, would that field have to be indexed or not? Would you be
yes, yeah. So in the case that, so I guess if we're searching our body field for, I don't know what we have, probably lorem in there.
Mhm. Sure.
That's here our lorem entry is returned, and
Mhm.
I don't know if this is going to work, but if I edit that entry and add, because it was just the final sentence making that work. If I search dog now, I don't think it did return that. So I guess when you
Yeah.
save the entry, it reindexes it. Is that right?
Well, I was referring more in as far as the column in the table, because I know that not are all fields gonna be indexed or all columns. Um, Let me see. How can I ask
So,
this in a in a way that
so
makes more sense? Um,
I think
It's
maybe
up to the field type that you're using.
okay, okay, that makes sense.
The field
Okay.
type has a method called get search keywords, and that's basically its opportunity to take its data and return a string of keywords.
Okay,
Okay.
that makes sense.
And I think there's a there's a little. So if we looked at this entry in the database directly, I think this is. I've been migrating databases, and you'll notice this from time to time. If we just edited this and now added our final sentence, cat, which was just amazing. So now the word cat is in the database, but if we search it, it's not going to be indexed.
Right.
And until we go into our settings here and update our search indexes, we're not going to see that in our results. So now that we indexed it, we're going to get our result again because it's been indexed. And correct me if I've explored this, but it looks like all the indexing is taking place in craft_search index table.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know too much about search, so if Brandon or somebody else wants to speak to it, please step in and let us know what's going on here.
Well, the search indexes table, it's special for two reasons. The first is that everything that goes into it has been normalized to lowercase, and we've removed a lot of punctuation and things like that. And basically, all of the keywords that get saved there, they go through the exact same. They go through a particular basic normalization process that anything you search for also goes through. So it's a way of us, ensuring that we can query for the exact same term that has actually been saved without worrying about capitalization and all that kind of stuff. And then the other thing about it is that it's the only table that uses the MyISOM database engine, and that basically enables us to do what's called full text searching, which just speeds up certain queries. So.
And you could have done that with the most generic table, but then you would not have had the InnoDB transactional support, right?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, InnoDB didn't get full text searching until like
Right.
the most recent version or something like that.
Right.
And we can't like start requiring people to have MySQL, whatever
Yeah,
it
the latest
was,
version. That makes sense.
5.9 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Got it. How are you? I was noticing like you've stripped out the @ sign from the email address, and you've basically replaced what is it? My grammar is amazing. The apostrophe T, the apostrophe in the end of some words, S's kind of get called out in that respect too. I guess that's just a apostrophe being removed as well. How do you deal with pluralization and such in the search?
I'm not sure if we are.
Okay.
Lodewijk actually wrote the search stuff for us, and I know enough about it to be dangerous, but that's about it.
We'll learn more in our practice searches everywhere. So
Yeah.
Here's a quick question from Adam. He says, can you set those search parameters via a query string in the URL or a post request?
Yeah, in the template, sure. Sure, you just you can get to anything that was passed into query string or post via craft.request.getPost or craft.request.getQuery, or if you don't care, then craft.request.getParam.
So
and then you can compose your own parameters and pass it to the query or whatever.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Of that, I guess I'm getting for the body page will and we get our result there. The same. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, okay, moving on. We'll look a bit at the search in the code beyond this. That's where it's all happening. That's where we're seeing all of these parameters in use. There are a few other, yeah, so those are all the parameters you can find on the documentation page. And so then we'll start digging into the code. So, or Selvin, did you have any more questions in this strange part of the front end that you never see?
That I never see. No, I'm sure I'm gonna have some more questions that relate to this once we get to the other stuff that I've played with a lot more. Because this stuff right here, it's even though I haven't messed with it very much, it's incredible how approachable this is and how much sense it makes. So I guess that's kind of props to PNT for that.
All right, so now we want to start digging into the code. For whatever reason, we want to understand this better, or we're trying to troubleshoot something and see how it's working. And so where do we start looking for the craft entries tag? So in craft, everything starts with this craft variable, or most things start with this craft variable, and are followed by something else. And I guess maybe I'm not explaining that right. It's not everything, but when you see this craft dot entries, we have a signal that we can look for this or what's happening here in the variables folder. And so if we folder structure here, here I'm in the craft app folder, and just like in our plugins, we have a variables folder back here, or perhaps like craft in our plugins, we also have a variables folder. And we see that we're looking for craft.entries variable, or we're looking for the craft variable, period, I guess. And here is our craft variable. Actually, so am I explaining that wrong? So you use the craft variable, and we all get namespaced or pushed up a level to the second level there. Is that right?
When you type craft,
Yeah.
you're at that point referring to a variable that we've defined in our twig extension called craft, which is set to an instance of the craft variable class, if that makes sense. So when you do craft.entries, it's basically just like any other variable. It's saying, okay, this craft variable that I already have, let's look for an entries variable or property on top of that, or a function called entries or whatever.
Got it. So right here in this initial get function, we're passing the name of that second value there,
let me pull it up.
which tries to resolve. Yeah, I can give you.
So that's that get function. That's a magic getter, and that's basically used for looping plugins into that variable. So that's basically what PHP calls a magic getter, which means if you have an instance of a class and you're trying to get a property on it that isn't defined by the class, PHP will call get function, which gives the class an opportunity to return like a dynamic property with that name. So if you had a plugin, called foobar, and you were to type craft.foobar, that magic getter would be our opportunity to say, okay, is there a plugin called foobar? If so, let's return its variable.
Okay.
So
let me know if you want to share your screen at all there. I'll keep moving until you let me know.
Yeah.
So, all right. So if we don't match a plugin, we're moving farther down this, and we're looking for our entries function, and down here we're going to find the public function entries, where we're passing our object of parameters which we pulled together, which are referred to as criteria in the back end here, and then really all we're doing then is calling our get criteria, the elements get criteria function, saying that we're looking for an entry element type and passing on that object of data.
Yeah. So this actually gets a little complicated. But that criteria attribute that you're seeing, that's actually to support a syntax you haven't covered yet, which is that the object that you were passing into find could also have been passed into the craft.entries function directly. So you could have said craft.entries pass in an object, and then at the end of that do .find without passing anything into find.
So we could have entries params here. Okay.
Exactly.
So I have. So basically, when you're passing parameters to either define as a find parameter or basically chaining it, are you essentially creating your own criteria without actually creating an instance of the criteria model? And is that essential?
You are actually interacting with a model.
Okay.
So craft.entries, that function returns a model, an instance of what we call ElementCriteriaModel. And it returns an instance of that set to find entries, as opposed to assets or users or tags or globals. And because it knows that it's set to find entries, there are a bunch of entry-specific attributes that it supports that the other ones don't. But basically, craft.entries is returning a model. And all models in Craft for plugins on the back end actually support a chaining method. And we did that so that you could have it in the templates. It's not necessarily a great syntax to use for PHP itself, but it is true that like if you were to create a new model instance, as long as it extends the base model class, you can do my model instance and then call some function that's the same name as an attribute and pass in the value of the attribute, and then just kind of chain them like that if you wanted. So craft.entries is basically like returning an instance of this model that's set to collect a bunch of criteria for entries you want to find, and then at any point within it you can call that model's find function or first or last or IDs or total. In which case that's the first time that you can call something on that model that takes you out of that model and returns an array or a number or whatever it is.
So I can tie that, or follow up if you want. I can tie that to I can get to the model in two files here if you want.
Sure.
So here we're calling elements get criteria, which is our reference to a service called elements. So we look at our elements service for the get criteria function, and here we find the get criteria function, which is just returning the element criteria model. I'm not sure, it's determining the element type here, I guess. And then here it's returning the element criteria model, which we start getting into what you were just describing. So,
right.
And this is where, I guess, this is where we have our find function in the element criteria model.
Yeah, so basically you're passing attributes to the find function.
Yeah, and it's calling back to this service for the findElements function. It's calling back to the elements service for the findElements function. So how does find get routed when it first? So, but when you call craft.entries section news find, is it still loading that entries first, or is it going straight to find and then kind of figuring out where?
So by the time you've typed craft.entries, everything beyond that, you're interacting directly with a new instance of this element criteria model class.
Okay.
So So if you did craft.entries.find or you did craft.entries.section and then pass in a section name and then .find, either way you're calling find on the same exact instance of ElementCriteriaModel,
Okay.
which is basically just taking all of its attributes that it has that you've defined on it, and it's passing it to the element service findElements function.
Okay. All right. And we'll go. And here's our findElements function where we
Yeah, and
start to
you
go
don't
through
even want to
all.
look through that code. It's
Yeah. So, well, yeah. So, I mean, to frame that a little more, I found as I was digging into this and trying to learn a little bit more about it, I think we're really at this point we really start getting into elements and what they are. And I don't know how much they've really been, documented or how many people are experimenting with them yet. But I was finding it interesting when we get to this element criteria model, the first thing that happens is we define a series of attributes that are basically attributes that exist on every element type within craft. And
right,
you correct me if I'm wrong, because I am definitely at the edge of my knowledge here. But all of these are going to be on every single element is going to have these different attributes in it. And then the next thing that happens is we define criteria attributes, which since we passed in our entry element type to this query, it's calling our entry element type, and this for would be found in the element type folder,
right,
our entry element type.php, and within that we're defining extra attributes that are only available on our entry element type.
right,
So we can start seeing here that entries have unique slugs, not element types. Entries have after and before parameters, um, not just any element in the system.
right.
So
And that's because those things map to properties that um, are specific to entries. So after and before are talking about the post date, and the concept of a post date is unique to entries. There's no reason for a user to have a post date. There's no reason you would want to get all users that are set to go live between this date and that date. You wouldn't need that. So we decided post date and expiry date were basically entry-only attributes. Same thing with the slug, and same thing with author ID. You wouldn't give an author ID to a user or to an asset. I mean, you might have a need to specify who took a photo, but you could do that. That you don't inherently need to know that. So that's something that you would just do with a custom field. Um, so everything that's like an entry-specific attribute or a user-specific attribute, those things are generally map back to the actual entries or users tables, as opposed to the central elements tables. And they're things that we just felt like this is the concept of a post date and an expiry date and an author. Like those are what define what an entry is, as opposed to a user or an asset. So, entries would never need every single entry wouldn't need a file name parameter, because they just it's a different type of element. So.
Yeah, I
got
think it
it.
makes sense to specialize that.
Yeah, and so I guess what else happens here is we start adding the custom fields to what's happening there. And so then I guess that gets into the second thing I was realizing about these element types, which was now we kind of build our attributes and what we're dealing with this element, and then we call that find function is being called, and it's calling the findElements function over in the elements service. And we won't get into this too much, but a couple of things that are happening here is it 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 starts building the elements query. Um, which just starts building your SQL query for what you're getting as results. And then the next thing you see happening here is it's actually I think so. Build elements query. If we look at that real quick, to what elements are doing here, our build elements query. I'm out of my league here.
I wrote this
what I
stuff,
what
and
I,
it's still complicated. So
Yeah, well, I guess the point I'm making is the next thing one of the things I found in here somewhere is we have a modify elements query, which is
right.
in addition to build elements query, and I'm not exactly sure where
Well, so
that
that's
happens.
okay.
Oh,
So
at the bottom. It's at the bottom of that.
yeah, that's in the bottom of build elements query.
And
Um,
so,
I think
go on.
that the best way to make sense of that is to go back to the uh, the element criteria model, where remember you've basically got an array of common criteria attributes that all elements could have. So
Hmm.
things like parent of, child of, ID, things like that. That you know, it made sense for us to say, okay, every single element type um, is going to possibly want these as criteria attributes. Um, and for all of those, our element service knows exactly what SQL to write when you enter a value for those criteria attributes. Um, but our central service has no idea what SQL it should add when you type, uh, where author ID equals 5 if you're looking for entries. It has no idea, it doesn't know anything about the entries table. It doesn't know anything about the concept of authors. So the find elements and the build element query functions themselves, the central functions inside the element service, those are basically going to build out the SQL for as much of the criteria attributes that they know about and know exactly how to translate. Um, and then the modify function that you find at the end of that, the modify elements query, that's basically where it gives the element type a chance to add its own SQL to the query. So that basically, if you're looking for entries, at that point it would call the entry element type and say, hey, someone's looking for entries. I've done as much as I can here, but I know you've got some custom criteria attributes, so you take a look and see if any of those are being used, and you deal with modifying the SQL for those. So entry element type would then take the SQL query that's being built and say, oh, well, it looks like they're searching for author ID equals 5, so I will add, I will join in my entries table and add where author ID equals 5 to the query. So that's basically, it's kind of, we do as much as we can centrally, and then but it's kind of a joint effort between the central service and whatever element type is actually being queried. And that's the chance that the element type has to interject and add its own conditions and stuff.
Great. Yeah, that helps. So at this 360 line, we're done finishing what we know how to build from the element criteria model. We call modify elements query, and then we start building the element specific part of the query.
Right.
And yeah, and so that was the main point I wanted to communicate there, is that there's this interesting relationship of how these elements are extending this core criteria model in the system. I noticed, and I haven't seen this in the other interface, there's also a reference to scoring here. Is that functional yet?
I think it must be. I think that there's a couple different if memory serves. There's a couple different scenarios um, where you might be looking for elements, and we score things a little differently depending on the scenario. But I'd have to spend some time diving in
Yeah.
re-familiarizing myself with that code to remember exactly what that is.
Is that something we might be able to use in our own plugins scoring or helping score and prioritize results? Or I guess can we add things to the search index in our own plugins, or is that something that all elements, as long as we tag the element or the field type correctly, it gets added for us?
Yeah, right now it's all pretty tied down. So
Okay.
I don't think custom element types have much control over that. I mean, the search service is basically like we've tried to do like a pretty good job at the basic stuff that you'd need to use, but I
Mhm.
wouldn't say that it's necessarily advanced search stuff. Um, I think down the road there might be an opportunity for someone to write like a really robust, custom search, custom scoring, and all that kind of stuff search module. But we felt like you can only really go so far if you're using the database, and you can't really go beyond the database unless you have more control over the environment, or unless you're willing to say, well, half of our users aren't going to be able to use it. So we just felt like it was appropriate for Craft itself to have like a pretty simple and database-based search index, and um, so we've kind of built it with that frame of mind. It does a pretty good job at what it's meant to do, but its feature set isn't necessarily huge.
Got it. So, Adam, Carlo, Selvin, any questions?
If no one else has any questions, then I would like to ask, how does the I'm familiar how most of these things work, but coming from someone that understands the active record form of accessing a database, as well as writing custom queries. How would you, Brandon, describe what you've tried to do here? Because I've worked with Yi a little bit, but not extensively, and I know that they use the active record, right? So when you were talking about the entries, and it seems like you probably have kind of a specialized base model that might extend the active record with its own behavior, but then you also have a lot of element types that are kind of specialized. Like the entry seems to be like one that's the most specialized at this moment because it has a lot of different behavior and different things that you can do with it. But how much does it differ, or how much do you deviate from the active record in some of the queries that you execute? And because you have criterias and all of that stuff, like how much did you guys have to do in order to accomplish the things that you wanted to do, while try to stay within the active record scope so that it can be understandable in that way?
Well, the simple answer is we haven't really factored Active Record into any of this stuff.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
we we like Active Record. We used to use it a lot more, but it's there's a little bit of a performance hit that comes with it,
Yep.
because anytime you instantiate an Active Record class, it's got to do a query to familiarize itself with the database table that you're going to be using it with. Um, and it's just the extra memory of loading an entire new instance of that every time you wanna do anything with it. And the queries and the memory footprint started to add up quite a bit. So um, maybe half a year ago or so, we started scaling back, and I think at this point, just from simply moving away from Active Record, we've pretty much cut off half the SQL queries per request,
Hmm.
um, and the memory footprint's gone down maybe 20 to 25% of what it used to be.
Okay.
Um, so I mean, we're not against using it from a plugin standpoint because those aren't going to really happen on every single request.
Hmm.
Um, and it's nice to use, and we're still using it when appropriate, but we felt like it wasn't something we wanted to require for the element stuff. So, and like if you look through the building out these queries, it can get kind of complicated. You're joining in multiple tables, and I think that you kind of would lose the benefit of active record after a certain point, anyways. Like at some point, it's
Sure.
just easier to deal with a query builder and have precise control over the tables you're joining in and stuff like that.
So basically, and I think that's a really good clarification for me as a developer, because instead of thinking of a deep kind of a grandparent to everything and all the models, I should really look at the active record that you guys use to do certain things. But for the most part, every model may have its own custom queries that you're writing to basically implement a certain method. So they don't. It's not like it's a huge hierarchy. Like you probably have some models may share certain things, but in reality, you guys are doing a lot of custom stuff within each element type and each model, sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, like as I said, we're still using them. I think that the one place where we just, where it's just great is for like anytime you're saving anything.
Right.
Because then you get all the validation, and the validation, factors in all the other existing rows and all that kind of stuff, and like that, you just save a ton of time by using, active record classes in that case.
Yeah.
And I think that's like kind of the one place where it's like, okay, well, we probably will never go away from it for that.
Right.
But at the same time, like in when we're just grabbing data, like it's probably just easier to query it ourselves, especially with the element type stuff. When all you're doing is playing, like your element type is only playing a very small role in the actual querying of the data. It's just it's so much easier to write like a couple lines of PHP saying, oh well, if they're requesting that the author ID equals 5, then let's join in this table and include that conditional. To have to set up an entire active record class and deal with
Right.
Relating that to the others and having it'd just be a big pain in the butt. So
yeah. So it would be safe to assume that something like the entry tag will never have a delete method that will allow you to delete from the template, because it would make sense, obviously.
No.
Right. Okay. All right. That's kind of all I had on that one.
All right. Well, sounds like we've reached a stopping point for this round. Unless anybody else wants to stand up with a question, I think we're good to wrap it up. Thanks for coming out for another Straight Up Craft Dev Day. We'll be back at an unpredictable time, an unpredictable day, and
Absolutely.
we'll end this broadcast now. And if anybody wants to hang around and make a few more comments, we won't disappear.